Okay. Well, hopefully this is working this time. Um, so I'm Owen O'Neill. I run For As Fast is my channel, and tonight I want to talk to you about two fundamental periods in Irish history. And because I'm down here in Kerry, in South Kerry, in Valentia Island, that were particularly important here. One was the 9 Years' War, um, which was, as everyone knows, the end of the 1590s, beginning of the 1600s. Um, it was a period when the history of Ireland was being remade, when Hugh O'Neill and others set out and came close to forging a new path, and building a new state in a new Irish state. They came close to winning, but as we'll see, they were defeated because of what happened at Kinsale. The other period is the first half of the 19th century, or more accurately, the say between 1820 and 1850. This is the period that covers Catholic emancipation and the repeal movement, and ends with the apocalypse, with the horror of the famine. It was a period when um, quite a lot was achieved. A new modernity was built, when the most of what was had been built in the 17th century, 18th century, like this new colonial state, the ascendancy, strong discrimination against Catholics, when most of that was overturned, and when there was a very strong campaign for repeal of the Act of Union, which was widely supported but failed. It was also a time when there was a mass movement of the poor, the Catholics, which could have been, which I have a feeling was the first mass movement in European history. If it wasn't the first, it was one of the first. It was very important because it created an idea of democracy and democratic action in Ireland, which remains to the present. Now, let's let me just try and share the screen so I can follow my lectures. Um, so, as I was saying, what I'm discussing is two key moments in the struggle for modernity in Ireland: the 9 Years' War, and then the period between Catholic emancipation and the famine. Now, this is a period that features what I call unlikely radicals. You have people like Hugh O'Neill and Daniel O'Connell. They weren't exactly radicals, but they ended up proposing, undertaking radical action, leading radical movements. Um, so you could say they're conservative radicals, radical conservatives. And in a way, after I decided to present this lecture, um, when I was starting to get it together, I realized that I am echoing Sean O'Foylan. Sean O'Foylan, the writer, wrote a few history books, but his two best knowns are The Great O'Neill and King of the Beggars, about Daniel O'Connell. The first, of course, is by Hugh O'Neill. So in a way, I'm echoing him. I'm not drawing much on his ideas directly, but apart from highlighting the importance of these two periods. So before beginning, it's important to highlight the idea of Whig history. Unless you've studied history, like in university, you might know what Whig history is. However, it was a very important idea. Less so at the moment, but up to say 30, maybe 50 years ago, it was kind of the official history of England. Whig history sees English or British history as a march towards greater freedom. This march starts more or less with Elizabeth I, in part because she's so popular, good Queen Bess, etc., despite the mess she made in Ireland. But it especially gained speed with the Glorious Revolution. Both the 9 Years' War and Daniel O'Connell are excluded from this version of history, essentially because they don't fit in. They like whatever truth Whig history has for England, for Ireland, it doesn't. Irish history during this period was a period of repression, especially the 16th and 17th century, the destruction of the Gaelic system, destruction of the Old English. The Catholics lost most of the land. It was a period of great change and normally bad change, a mistaken picture. If you incorporate Irish history with English history, you'll dramatically undermine the myth of Whig history. And actually, more importantly, you cannot present English history without incorporating Irish history. After all, Ireland was part of the British kingdom for several hundred years. And even before that, there was great interaction between Ireland and what would be between Ireland and the island of Britain. Ireland and Scotland, Ireland and Wales, both countries were settled by the Irish. There was trade. The story of St. Patrick shows you how old the links are. The Normans came in 1169, and indeed before that there were some of, if I'm not mistaken, after after William conquered England, I have a feeling that several Normans fled to Ireland. So although the English failed to understand Ireland, they really had no excuse because Ireland predates England. And Irish history and English history are intertwined, for better or for worse. You cannot tell the history of either country without looking at the other one. Now, going to the 1590s, Ireland was a country of lords and lordships. If you can see in the map here that these are just kind of the first level of lordships. Kerry, you have MacCarthy Moore, who hold most of what is now South Kerry. Sullivan Beara holds the Beara Peninsula. North Kerry, you have Fitzmaurice here, O'Connor Kerry here, the Earl of Desmond here and here. So the whole country is divided into lordships. Lordships are the key political unit for understanding Ireland at that time. To be a lord, the idea of being a lord was something sophisticated and complex. In Portuguese and Spanish, there is a concept called fidalgo hidalgo. It basically means son of somebody important. In the English system, for example, one of the Percys, I think it was Richard Percy, was one of the captains who fought in the Battle of the Yellow Fort. He was just an army officer. Yet he was more than that. He was the son of an earl. He was the grandson of an earl. He was the great grandson of an earl. His, great 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 grandfather had come over with William the Conqueror. Yet he was not a noble. Because he was not the firstborn, he was suddenly thrown out of nobility. Whereas with the Portuguese and Spanish concept, if you were born into a noble family, you remained a noble. You were a fidalgo, hidalgo. You could be poor, but you still had this quality which distinguished you from other people. In Gaelic society, there was something similar. So Hugh O'Neill ended up in charge of the O'Neills of Dungannon. He became Earl of Dungannon. His brother Cormac, and indeed his elder brother Art, they weren't lords under the English system, but under the Irish system, under the Gaelic system, they were lords. Now, I think the English in the main did not understand how this system operated. They distrusted it. A large part was because it was very dynamic due to the fact you didn't have primogeniture. Strangely enough, down the MacCarthy Moors had a period of a few hundred years where the eldest son always inherited, but that stands out. The O'Neills didn't. The O'Neills and Dungannon, before Hugh O'Neill, was a cousin of his Turlock. Before that was Shane O'Neill. Before that was Clonbacnoch. And there were fights between all of them for the succession. Also, the borders didn't stay changed. They didn't stay the same. So what we have here is a nice map dividing Ireland into lordships. However, these changed a lot. Sometimes land would change because of marriage. Sometimes because a lord had taken a mortgage and he couldn't pay it back. Sometimes because of battle. Sometimes because of punishment. They were very, very complex. So in Irish history, when you see that, such and such a clan was based in such and such a place, it's not always true. It's true for certain periods, but it can be true for some, like the O'Neills or Tyrone, etc. But they moved, and a lot of those minor lordships came and went and fell. Another important idea was way predating Hobbes and Locke, was the idea of a real social contract. The Gaelic lordships were based on a social contract mainly between the lord and the elite, but in a way also covering the peasants. He had to protect them. He could tax them, but he had to protect them. If he didn't, the other members of the elite could switch allegiance or topple him, while the peasants, the workers, could actually just run away. There was in Ireland a shortage of labour. The population wasn't particularly high. Now, let me just move on. Something else the English found very complex was the flexibility of Gaelic identity. The 16th century was a time when identity was changing. You can see this by looking at Shakespeare, though it's complicated. So identity, you had local identities, you had religious identities, provincial identities, and the state was starting to try and claim identities. For example, in the early 1600s, under James I, say around 1607, the time of the flight of the Earls, several members of his Privy Council, including the senior ones, were receiving payments from the Spanish, as well as possibly from the Dutch. They saw no problem with this. The Spanish were basically bribing them to stay on the Spanish side, and the Dutch were doing the same. They were able to do this. They were able to receive this money. There wasn't this fully formed. The state couldn't yet form your identity in the way it would come to form later. And Gaelic identity seems to have been particularly dynamic, particularly flexible in the European context. Many English and Spaniards found it attractive, although many did look at it as poor, as out of date, as archaic, as savage. Others found it attractive. This picture here is a famous picture. Is Thomas Lee, one of them. He was captain of the Queen's Cairn for a while. He is best known for two things. One, killing Fiach Mac Hugh O'Byrne, and secondly, rebelling in favor of the Lord of Essex in London and getting executed. But he had himself painted by a famous Dutch painter in what were seen as the traditional clothes of a cairn, with a javelin, a spear, a shield on his back, and not wearing any trousers, or what would have been, they would really have worn leggings. There's a word for it, but I can't remember. Now, another interesting character is Pedro Blanco. He was a survivor of the Spanish Armada in 1588. He ended up as a servant to Hugh O'Neill, a very trusted servant, and stayed with Hugh O'Neill until 1607. He only returned to Spain, to the Europe mainland, with O'Neill when O'Neill fled Ulster in 1607 in the flight of the Earls. This identity was very complex and was always changing, which made the English scared of it, especially perhaps the ones influenced by Puritanism. They did not like this flexibility, probably because they couldn't understand it, because it didn't fit in with their preconceived notions. Although Ireland, Gaelic, especially Gaelic Ireland, was poor, and although it was underdeveloped and on the periphery, it was deeply in contact with the European mainland. Um, and it was heavily influenced by European ideas, such as Thomism, but also military ideas and also trade. However, one thing the Gaelic Irish and the Gaelic intelligentsia was very good at was hiding change underneath an archaic mask. If you look at Baha Edru O'Donnell, the life of Red Hugh O'Donnell, you'll find this. The same in the Annals of the Four Masters. They write about battles, but the way they write, it sounds like people are using spears and swords and arrows, etc. They don't really mention guns much. They perhaps they didn't understand, but the way they portray battles is a very outdated way. Now, as regards to the 9 Years' War, earlier was attempting to forge a new type of Irish state, or at least attempt Elizabeth from and others from building a colonial type of state. What he wanted and what the people he supported wanted. Sorry, his support was largely based on elites. He got great support from many Gaelic nobles. In Kerry, one such was Domhnall MacCarthy. He was the illegitimate son of the last MacCarthy Moore, who's also called Domhnall, who was also the Earl of Clancaird. I'll come back to him in a couple of minutes. Now, O'Neill was basically looking for something that would have allowed religious freedom. In other words, they would have been able to be Catholic, able to practice their Catholicism, priests would have been unhindered, etc. And they also wanted a sort of what could be labeled as home rule. On the other hand, O'Connell was from one of the few Gaelic noble families that managed to survive the complications, shall we say, the tumults of the 16th and 17th century. His family was not an important family. They basically were the constables of Ballycarbery Castle. Ballycarbery Castle is between Carsavine, is outside Carsavine. It's in Valentia Harbour, and in the 16th century, the English seem to have regarded it as part of Valentia. So the O'Connells looked after that castle for the O'Neills. So they were very minor Gaelic nobility. They survived, in part because in the 18th century, Daniel O'Connell's uncle, Hunting Cap, he made a fortune from smuggling, essentially, and he had good relations with his Protestant neighbors. He kept his head down in terms of politics, made money, and managed to keep land. Though a lot of the land was, like for example, Daniel O'Connell's father rented a large part of Valentia from Trinity College. Trinity College held a huge amount of South Kerry. Hunting Cap, he was completely unpolitical. Although, for example, one of his brothers was the last colonel of the Irish Brigade in France. He actually also served in the British Army for a while after the Revolution. But more importantly was his aunt, who Eileen Dove O'Connell. She is best known for writing Crína Artillery, the keening of artillery, a beautiful, very long poem and song about her husband who was killed by the Sheriff of Cork. Her husband, Artillery, was actually, I think he was a captain in the Austrian army, showing you these connections. And he had a long-standing feud with the Sheriff of Cork and was eventually killed. Daniel O'Connell, he saw the violence of the French Revolution and indeed of 1798. He wasn't in favor of the use of violence, but he managed to get a mass movement which achieved Catholic emancipation in 1829, so that finally Catholics could sit in the House of Commons. They were also able to become senior barristers. And then he led a mass campaign for repeal. These were mass movements of the poor they excluded. Okay? So both, as I said earlier, both O'Neill and O'Connell, and indeed Domhnall MacCarthy, they weren't radicals, but they were in movements that had radical impacts. Now let's look a bit at the MacCarthys. So this is a map of the land ownership in South Kerry and the Beara Peninsula and a bit of Cork. This is the holding. This is the MacCarthy Moore lordship. Now, if you actually look at it, this color here, that's the actual holdings of MacCarthy Moore. They were very restricted. They were here and up here mainly. So you had lands like near Palace, Ballycarbery. He ruled over. He was the lord of all this area, but O'Sullivan Moore and O'Sullivan Bear probably held more land than him, because it was sort of a hierarchical system of lords. So, and then even the MacCarthys themselves, like Valentia Island, is split into three different MacCarthys three different MacCarthy septs held power here. MacCarthy Moore had the smallest part, but the most important part, because it controlled the fishing. They had what's now Glanleam and Knightstown, if you know the island, Begnish Island, and Ballycarbery, and what's called Over the Water. So they controlled the entrance to Valencia Harbour, which was very important for fishing. A lot at that stage, there would have been a lot of Spanish and maybe French fishermen coming in and landing, and they would pay money so they could salt their fish. So, if just to tell you, this is Iveragh here. Killarney is more or less here. Carsavine is here, and Killorglin is along here, and up here, more or less here would be Castlemaine. So they controlled a huge amount of Kerry, and this is the Beara Peninsula, other bits of Cork. So, and because the MacCarthys were almost unique with primogeniture, which I think was 6 generations of the eldest son succeeding in a row, which is very unheard of in the Gaelic system, they managed to stay together. The Normans had, because the MacCarthys originally were based around Castle, but they got pushed out of there by the O'Briens and the Normans. And the Normans indeed tried to push into Kerry, but they got defeated. I think it was 11 something, I can't remember, at the Battle of Callan. And so this area remained stable. But there was an interesting relationship between the Earl of Desmond, and this area was also called Desmond, the county of Desmond in a way. But the MacCarthys and the Fitzgeralds of Desmond had a bit of a complicated relationship. The Fitzgeralds often managed to extract rent from here. They would tend to see the MacCarthys as their underlords. The MacCarthys would deny this, but they still would have to pay off money. So, and things vary depending on the power of the MacCarthy lord. And if you look at, for example, Killorglin, which is somewhere around here, Killorglin, there was a castle there. The castle got occupied, burnt. It marked, in a way, the frontier between the English Fitzgeralds and the MacCarthys. It was an area of great conflict. Now, Domhnall MacCarthy Moore, he initially supported the Earl of Desmond in the Desmond rebellions. He managed to survive okay. In fact, he did quite well because some of the lands up here, Elizabeth wanted to include them in the plantation of Ulster, but he said, no, they're my lands. They were my tenants who were misbehaving, so he was given them. And he was actually made the Earl of Clancarty, the only one in this incarnation. But his son Tig was called Baron Valentia. His son died, so he had no heir. And in the 1590s, he was elderly and sick. And in the 1590s, so he died in 1596. So Hugh O'Neill at this stage is desperate to get Spanish aid. And everybody knows that if a Spanish fleet comes, it'll more than likely land in Munster because Munster is the nearest to Spain, the easiest to get to. So this area becomes of great, great importance. There were two potential heirs. So MacCarthy only had a daughter. She married Florence MacCarthy, who was from Carbery around here, another minor MacCarthy lordship. And the other person was Domhnall MacCarthy Moore, the illegitimate son. They both claimed the MacCarthy Moore lordship. Hugh O'Neill initially supported Domhnall MacCarthy, the illegitimate. However, Florence was a better politician, and he was quite friendly with O'Sullivan, and O'Sullivan played a very important role. He was the senior underlord or Iveragh of the MacCarthys, and at the MacCarthy inauguration, he had the slot tyrnus, the white rod of lordship. So he refused to give this to Domhnall MacCarthy, as did some other lords wouldn't support him. So Hugh O'Neill was forced to acknowledge Florence MacCarthy as being his MacCarthy Moore. This was a bad. O'Neill had no choice here, but it was a bad move because Florence MacCarthy was more interested in politicking. He wanted to stay in with Hugh O'Neill. He wanted to stay in with the English, and Lord Carew, the Lord President of Munster, essentially was a much better politician than him and really outwit him. Domhnall MacCarthy is pushed aside, but he turns up in Kinsale. He fights in the Battle of Kinsale. So he fights in the Battle of Kinsale. And actually, we have a couple of documents that mention him. The one on the left is basically a receipt for munitions, because the Spanish landed in Kinsale, as everyone knows, but a couple of weeks later, a few more ships, 6 or 7, they landed in Castlehaven. They also occupied Baltimore and Dunboy Castle, which is beside Castledownbere. And they had a lot of munitions, and unlike Don Juan de Aquila, who was the Spanish commander in Kinsale, they were not afraid to arm the Irish. So these are receipts signed by Domhnall MacCarthy. This one is basically for 100 arquebuses, 200 pikes, 4 quintales of powder, 2 quintales of cord, and 8 knives. So it's quite a big, it's quite a large amount of munitions. It's enough for a couple of, like a company was normally around 100 men. So here there's munitions for 300. However, it's interesting that the pikes there's twice the amount of pikes than guns, whereas in the Irish system, the Gaelic system, it was probably 3 or 4 times as many guns as pikes. However, the 4 quintales of powder and of cord were really welcome because the Irish were short of munitions at this stage. And in this other place, it's a Spanish officer describing Domhnall MacCarthy Moore, saying he's in the rocky castle of Valencia, and saying it's a very good place and that Domhnall MacCarthy Moore has offered it to the Spanish government. Now, just to kind of give a brief overview of the 9 Years' War. It was a war O'Neill and his Confederacy could have won. They were fighting for another path to modernity, for the right to live, for religious freedom, and for a new definition of identity. It was a political war. Outlasting Elizabeth would mean victory. Of course, he could beat English armies, but um, the fact if he had been undefeated, if his army was in play, his land, he still held his lands when Elizabeth died, it would mean a victory. It also became an international conflict because of Spain. Um, Spain had been fighting for several years a war with the Dutch. The Dutch had rebelled against them. This war spilled into an international one. First France, and then England began to support the Dutch, and then due to the Spanish Empire, and at this stage, from 1580 to 1640, Portugal was part of Spain. So the Dutch began to attack Spanish and Portuguese possessions in Africa, in the Americas, in the Philippines. So it was an international war, and for a while, the Irish theatre became very, very important. It was probably the most important Ireland has been in any major conflict, with the possible exception of when William was fighting James in the 1690s. Um, Gaelic society was poor and undeveloped, but the Irish were in contact with Spain. They were getting military support from them. They were getting ideas from Europe, and it was part of like the Catholic Reformation was underway in Ireland as well. Um, as I mentioned, O'Neill established a confederacy of nobles, radical conservatives perhaps, or unlikely radicals. Their ideas were very popular among the Gaelic Irish, even among those who went to the English side. Neil Garve O'Donnell is sort of a baddie, if you like, in that he is Hugh O'Donnell's cousin, but he went over to the English side. And if you look at the correspondence he has with the English, he basically asks for more or less the same thing that Hugh O'Neill asked for, which includes freedom of religion. In a way, you could say that O'Neill and his confederacy were pushed into war by the incompetence of Elizabeth, although O'Neill did a lot of provoking. Well, Elizabeth is seen as a very good queen of, while she's seen as a very good queen in England. In Ireland, she was a disaster, to say the least. Kind of everything she did went wrong. She was jealous if her Lord deputies became very successful, but she turned a blind eye to many of her minor officials, and she alienated both the Gaelic Irish and the Old English. She didn't make any attempt to incorporate the elites of the Gaelic Irish and the Old English into an English state. If she'd done that, like James had the sixth, James had become James I in England, he managed to incorporate some of the Gaelic elites, such as the Campbells. The Gaelic Irish were held in contempt by most English elites. Now, if you read the work of Hiram Morgan, he's written loads on the 9 Years' War. His stuff is very, very good. He points out the use of what he calls an ideology of fate and fatherland. This sophisticated political ideology, basically trying to create a new Irish identity, a Catholic Irish identity. In a way, he thought this would get him support from the Old English. However, most Old English, with partial exception of Munster, they didn't support him. But it was also very important in attracting support from Spain, because they could say, look, we're fighting for Catholicism. You have to help us. And there's an interesting priest, an intellectual called Peter Lombard. He's from Waterford. He was a priest in Louvain, the Irish college there, and he was sent to Rome. In Rome, Hugh O'Neill made him his agent. He wrote a book which has never been fully translated into English about the whole conflict. And it, for example, it uses, for example, the laudabiliter, which, if you didn't know, that was the document whereby the Pope gave the Lordship of Ireland to England. And he uses this to justify, to say that the Spanish had to help O'Neill because said, look, the Pope gave England to Ireland to improve, educate, civilize the Irish, but they're not doing that. They're doing the opposite. So therefore, they've lost the right to the Lordship of Ireland. So the Catholic kings have to help. Interestingly, at the time of the Bruce, when the Bruces came to Ireland, Domhnall O'Neill had a bit of a similar argument in the well-known remonstrances of Irish princes, which was sent to Rome, but it didn't really have an effect. Lombard became very high up in the Catholic Church. He actually played a role he was involved in the trial of Galileo. He was very skilled, became Archbishop of Dublin, but never set foot in Dublin. I just find it interesting if his skills, if he'd stayed in Ireland, could he have been of better use there? He was a bit of a waste in Rome for the Irish. In 1600, sorry, I'm bogging down a bit here in the details. In 1600, O'Neill had printed or disseminated a series of articles, his war aims in a way. He didn't make much use of them. He just frightened the English state for a while, but they're very interesting. Like there's 20 something of them. 6 are basically demanding freedom of religion and stopping the persecution of Catholicism in Ireland, saying that Ireland will be Catholic. The other ones are guaranteeing things like allowing the Irish trade where they wanted to, essentially demanding home rule in a way, and saying that, like, for example, no Irishmen should lose their lands for the faults of their ancestors. That would be a problem for many years because many Gaelic Irish didn't have paper because they hadn't needed it. Whereas an English guy could say, look, in 1300, the king gave this land to my great-great-grandfather, therefore it's mine. So in the 16th and 17th century, that was a big problem. So this is kind of a proto-nationalistic series of demands. They are very, very interesting. We don't have time to go into them, but they're worth looking at. They're worth reading if you ever have a chance. You can find them in the Celt site at UCC. Now, the 9 Years' War, O'Neill had a lot of success, and then in 1600, Elizabeth sends Lord Mountjoy, who becomes her winning general, for various reasons. He has a large army. He campaigns incessantly, except in Munster. In Munster, Carew does the same. Carew is very skilled at dividing the Irish. However, Mountjoy fails to break into Ulster, even though into Tyrone, basically. Even though a force on the Dockra lands near Lough Foyle and ends up taking over most of Tyrconnell or Dungannon. So Hugh O'Donnell was forced basically into Connacht, but Mountjoy, despite various attempts, fails to defeat O'Neill in a battle. And then the Spanish send a fleet. They had promised this fleet various times. It promised aid, but it kept getting diverted. Spain was the superpower in Europe at that moment, but it was a world superpower, and it had too many demands. So, like in 1596, there was a fleet, but that fleet ended up sailing late and it got destroyed by a storm. But it was also, although it was intended for Ireland, and many people believe it was intended for Ireland, it was diverted in the end. It was supposed to go to Brittany, but it sank. So there was always a threat during the war, and the English were always afraid the Spanish would land. But the force they sent was too small. It was less than 4,000 people. And although O'Neill has said it should only go to Munster if it's 6,000, I think. The Spanish were fighting among themselves. They land in Kinsale. They have no horse. There's no cavalry. They stay there, but the English come and besiege them. And then O'Neill and O'Donnell advance in winter and encircle the English. The defeat in the battle meant that this achievement is very overlooked. Kinsale is probably the most decisive battle in modern Irish history, because the loss of Kinsale means the war is lost. But it should not actually have been fought, because if you look at the map, in the center of the map is Kinsale, where the Spanish were. And then the English are heavily dug in. They have big trenches, with like very deep trenches and other fortifications. The Irish are here. The Gaelic Irish are here. The English are suffering terribly. They've been cut off by land, so their supplies have to come by sea. But the weather is bad. It's winter. The English are freezing. Many are dying every night. The Gaelic Irish, don't want to attack. They say there's no need to attack. We just wait here, which is probably true. Because if they'd waited another couple of weeks, Mountjoy would probably been forced to withdraw. And at that stage of withdrawal, he would have lost probably at least half his army. The Spanish commander, though, Don Juan de la Quilla, threw it all away. He insisted that the Gaelic Irish take offensive action. And it seems that he threatened to surrender. He said, unless you do this, I'll surrender. Because O'Neill and O'Donnell saw his battle plan and said, no way, this is madness. So he forced them, and for some reason they advanced in two large groups. Normally the Gaelic Irish would have been much more spread out, but they advanced in two large groups. They were it seems their objective was, this was Ardmartin Hill, which is the hill overlooking. They reached there, at least O'Neill reached there. When they reached there, the idea was they were supposed to distract the English, and then Don Juan would sally out with the Spanish army and meet him. However, this didn't happen. So O'Neill reaches there. O'Donnell is quite a bit behind. The English are aware O'Neill's there. They see him and they go, yes, we now have the chance for a decisive battle. Every English commander has wanted to fight this decisive battle. They know they can attack O'Neill with their cavalry, with their horse. So they start moving up. O'Neill sees them and he pulls back. He pulls back over a river and he stops by this stream. He stops by that. If he hadn't stopped, he probably would have managed to get away and there wouldn't have been a battle. But he stopped, and then the English tried to find a way across the stream. They find a way. The Irish cavalry tried to stop them, but the Irish cavalry they're basically ponies, and they don't have stirrups. The English cavalry ride into them and they smash them. And then the Irish cavalry retreat into their own men. So their own men are all bunched up, and their own horse run into them, divide them, smash them into they're totally out of formation, which means that the English horse can ride into them, and the Irish Hugh O'Neill's veterans who had won so many battles are routed, and the English cut them down. And then O'Donnell's men are coming up because they were quite a bit back, and they rout as well. And the whole battle is over very quickly, while Don Juan does nothing. He eventually half sallies out, but his men apparently say to him, look, there's fighting going on. But he says no. And he insisted on the battle, yet his role in the battle was negligible. He should have done something else. He was the one who said the Irish need to take offensive action. When they take it, he does nothing. And then the battle essentially destroys O'Neill's confederacy. However, the Spanish were still in Kinsale and were in a very good position. The English were, despite winning the battle, the English were very, very weak. The Spanish also had the other ports. A few days after the battle, Don Juan surrenders not only Kinsale but the other ports, which is another nail in the coffin of the war. Um, English victory, it cost them so much. Like it took them the best part of 6 months to recover. Like they were that weak. So it just shows you, if the Irish and the Spanish had decided just to stay in position, just to do nothing, they probably would have won. You can ask some questions. What would have happened if the Spanish had kept the other ports? For example, in 1602, a Spanish ship landed at Ardea Castle with money and munitions. It temporarily turned the tide. It helped O'Sullivan Beara win a few fights. That was just one ship with munitions and with money. And interestingly, the Spanish it's not the Spanish, the papal nuncio in 1643, he landed at the same castle. It's in the Beara Peninsula, but it's in the Kerry part of Beara, Tusist Castle, or Tusist, Ardea Castle in Tusist. It's famous for two important Spanish land, a papal landing and a Spanish landing. So the war led to the destruction of Gaelic Ireland. 1603, O'Neill surrenders. Domhnall MacCarthy, he survived the land. He was given some land, but had to surrender his claims to the lordship. So that huge amount of land we saw at the beginning is broken up. Some of it ends with Trinity College, others with various other English newcomers. The political structures of Gaelic Ireland were ended. The lordships were destroyed. Even Gaelic allies are treated badly, because if you look at the list of like Neil Garve O'Donnell, who fought against Hugh O'Neill, he was arrested around the time just after the flight of the Earls, with that minor rebellion in Inishowen. He was put on trial. The jury didn't find him guilty, but he was sent to the Tower of London, where he ended up for the rest of his life. And then in the 1640s and the 1690s, the results of those two wars resulted in the end of the Gaelic Irish and Old English. So in 1700, maybe even in 1690, you no longer talk about Gaelic Irish. You have a new category, the Catholic Irish. And in come the well-known penal laws, etc. So hold on, where am I? So, damn it. Okay. So survivors. A few families managed to survive this. Some MacCarthy survived in Muskerry for most of the 17th century. Others survived longer. So, but to survive, they had to anglicize or re-anglicize, become Protestant, become part of the ascendancy. The O'Briens of Thomond were very good at this. Thomond, the Earl of Thomond fought in the 9 Years' War, fought for the English. Lord Fitzmaurice and the Knight of Kerry were on Hugh O'Neill's side for most of the 9 Years' War. They fought very well. But the ones who survived the Cromwellian Wars and the Williamite Wars, after that, they were Protestant and Anglicized again. There was a massive loss of land, either through confiscation or economic loss. Everybody learns in school that, like, I think after, say, 1700, like less than 10% of the land in Ireland was held by Catholics. With a huge transfer of land. This leads to a loss of function of Gaelic nobility. So the Gaelic lordships, the Gaelic septs are broken up, are destroyed, are gone. There's no more function for Gaelic nobles. They're not able to protect the people. I know there are a few who claim Gaelic titles. They say, "Oh, I'm whatever, O'Donoghue, whatever." But these, I don't know. I find it a bit pointless in a way, because you're not. It's something that's lost its place in modern society. In Kerry, however, one minor Gaelic elite family survived, as I'd mentioned, the O'Connells. So Daniel O'Connell, we're going to talk about now for the last part. Of gone for almost an hour. Got bogged down way too much. So O'Connell was born in Carrin near Carsavine. His father was a merchant and a farmer. So the O'Connells, I said, were minor Gaelic nobility. They looked after Ballycarbery Castle. Carrin is a few kilometres, 2 or 3 kilometres away from Ballycarbery Castle. Interestingly, initially Daniel O'Connell was fostered out. So he went to live with a very poor family um, up the mountains, like probably 10 kilometers away. I think he spent 2 to 4 years there. Then he came home, and then shortly afterwards, he went to live with his famous uncle, Hunting Cap. Hunting Cap lived in a different part of the peninsula, sort of Derrynane. If you look at the tip of the Iveragh Peninsula, Derrynane, sort of Carsavine's on the right-hand side, the north. Derrynane is on the south. There, I'd mentioned already, Hunting Cap was a moderate. He stressed keeping his head down, so he managed to gain a lot of wealth, build a beautiful house, which is still there, although O'Connell did some work there, Derrynane House. I mentioned already Daniel O'Connell's uncle, also called Daniel, and Evelyn Dove. O'Connell is educated in France for a short while, but because of the revolution, he heads back to England. And then he becomes a barrister. Before looking at the rest of his career, it is important to just look briefly at some of the political currents of of the late 18th and early 19th century. Green artillery, that marks the brutality of the penal system. It shows you how brutal things were in a way, how bad they were. 1798 and 1789 are other forms of brutality, which leads O'Connell to start thinking about the question of non-violence. Can you campaign against a state? Can you campaign for change without violence? While South Kerry is isolated from Dublin and London, this isolation enabled the O'Connells to thrive, to make for Hunting Cap to build up a fortune. But they were not isolated from the continent. As you can see, one uncle was in the French army. His aunt had married an Austrian captain. So there was a continual connection. Another connection was smuggling, which you could say was a form of trade. The next thing was the active union. Although some Catholics might have been initially semi in favor of the active union, which possibly includes Hunting Cap, others, including O'Connell, were very, very opposed to it. They saw it as something bad. And then there is a new rising question, the Catholic question. The penal laws have been gradually repealed. However, although some Catholics are allowed to vote, depending on how much property they hold or lease, they're not allowed to sit in the House of Commons. They're also barred from from becoming a senior barrister, and indeed from becoming the monarch of England. But the Catholic question would become increasingly important, and one that in the initial decades of the 19th century, the English state struggled to answer. So O'Connell initially follows what his uncle had wanted him to do. He made a very successful career as a barrister, making a name himself. However, he's becoming more and more outspoken, starts to criticize the people in charge, to the annoyance of Hunting Cap. Hunting Cap was always in favor of keeping your head down, so no one will notice us. O'Connell, although he got money from Hunting Cap, and although he got money as a barrister, he was continually suffering from financial problems kind of throughout his life. Probably this was like part because of his political life or as a barrister. He had to be always be moving, always spending money while he was trying to keep a home for himself, especially in Derrynane. And maybe because he was expected, he was expected to spend money as a member of the elite, as a leader. So he's part of the Catholic Committee, which was essentially a middle class group of Catholics, a Catholic elite, trying to figure out how to reduce the discrimination against Catholics. However, it transforms. In 1823, the Catholic Association is set up. Unlike the Catholic Committee, this is a mass movement, possibly the first mass movement in Europe. It's funded by what's called the Catholic rent. So basically, everyone paid a small amount of money, but because there were so many of them, they managed to gather a large amount of money. And initially, they were concerned with electing their main, say, way of acting was to elect liberal Protestants as MPs to try and build support for themselves. However, 1828, they're presented with a unique opportunity. A new administration, the Wellington Peel administration, not particularly pro-Irish, it took office. Now, those nominated as ministers at the time had to resign as MPs and run again. The Catholic Association had taken the decision to oppose these. Now, a guy, William Vesey Fitzgerald, who was actually a liberal Protestant, he was the MP for Clare. He was appointed minister, so he resigned and had to run again. He was actually quite popular, so they found it very difficult to campaign against, to get someone to campaign against them, to get another Protestant. So ultimately, they took the decision that Daniel O'Connell would run. He ran a very good campaign, got massive support, although most of the people supporting him in Clare wouldn't have the vote. And he won. He won by 2,057 votes to 928. This shows you how small the electorate was at the time. This created a conundrum. O'Connell was not allowed to sit as an MP. He had to sit as an MP, would have to take the oath of supremacy, which he wouldn't. The British government blinked, and to the annoyance of the king, Catholic emancipation was granted, and O'Connell was able to sit as MP. However, there was a sting in the tail here. The electorate was reduced. The English raised the basic, the mean, like the what you call it, the ceiling for who could have a vote. They raised the amount of money you had to have. So when O'Connell was elected, there was total electorate was 216,000 in Ireland. This was reduced to 37,000. All men, by the way, all men. So the O'Connell phenomenon, this began to roll on. He had created this mass movement, a non-violent mass movement. According to Fuelon, O'Connell indeed created the modern people. I wouldn't quite go as far, but I say he helped forge it dramatically. But he helped lay the path for a mass involvement in constitutional democratic politics. The idea that you can actually campaign for something, you can get change through democracy, through peaceful means, through campaigning for it. You can force change, as happened in 1829. Was O'Connell a radical, a conservative, or both? I'd say a bit of both. We try in history too much to try and pin people down as one thing or another. O'Connell, like any human being, was full of contradictions. He did good stuff, other stuff less good. You could say he was a radical conservative. I'd say he was less conservative than many people paint him. For example, in the question of abolition, he was very, very anti-slavery. Indeed, he was visited by the very famous Frederick Douglass. O'Connell was consistent in his opposition of slavery. In this, he was different from the Young Irelanders. some of whom wanted to leave the question of slavery to the US. Others, such as Mitchell, was quite famous, supported slavery in the Confederacy. Mitchell appears to have been racist, to say the least. He actually ended up in the Confederacy, the US, the American Confederacy. His son was killed, I'm fairly sure, in the Civil War. He supported the South. O'Connell was much more modern, much more progressive in his views. He abhorred slavery, and rightly so. So, after Catholic emancipation, O'Connell begins to he starts a campaign against the Act of Union, to repeal the Act of Union. They didn't start using Home Rule then; it was repeal. In this, he was aided by the 1832 Reform Act, which abolished what were called rotten boroughs. So there was many MPs were elected by a very small number of people. Basically, one person could decide in some of them, and the franchise was expanded. This resulted in O'Connell leading a party of 39 MPs. Again, something new. I think English parliamentary history, they neglect how important Irish were in Parliament and creating new things in Parliament. Like 2 weeks ago, the New Jersey Senator, Cory Booker, I think his name is, he spoke for like 25 hours in nonstop in the American Senate. Under Parnell and some of the others, the Irish were doing that much before. So O'Connell, he starts leading this mass campaign, having what are called monster meetings in various parts of Ireland. He's elected Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1841, and he's the first Catholic to be mayor of Dublin since 1688 or 1689. So that's quite an achievement. Dublin probably was a majority Catholic all that time, but the Catholics were excluded to a great extent. Now O'Connell becomes the first Catholic Lord Mayor, and which sparks a movement of Dublin in a way trying to appropriate O'Connell, because like the main street in Dublin, O'Connell Street, has this huge statue of O'Connell. Well, ironically, I don't think there's any statue of O'Connell in Kerry. In Carsavine, there's a little bust of him somewhere, and maybe just some small statues. So O'Connell is campaigning for repeal. However, his movement starts to split. There's emergence of a group called Young Ireland, based on other nationalistic groups elsewhere in Europe. They're more radical than O'Connell, and they are much more pro the use of violence. And ironically, as I mentioned, some of them are pro-slavery. Others think they don't want to annoy the Americans because they want support from America. So while in some terms they're often portrayed as being more progressive than O'Connell, more radical, in others they were more conservative. Then apocalypse. If you look at this picture, this is the workhouse in Carsavine, a horrible place. It's funny when I see people talking about the famine and saying, "Oh, it was genocide. The English killed everyone. The British took all the food." They never talk about the workhouse. The workhouse system, in my mind, was what turned bad famine into a horror. All famine is horrific. It made it so bad. So in the 1830s, the English in England, they abolished the previous poor law, which allowed people to be treated, receive care, receive money, or receive food in their own homes, and replaced with the workhouse. So if you were going to receive any help from the state or from the government, you had to go into the workhouse, which is explicitly designed to have as bad conditions as to be as bad as the worst outside. So it was designed to just keep people out of it. The idea was that there were a small number of deserving poor, but the vast majority of poor were undeserving. They were lazy. They were poor because it was their own fault. So It's an idea that you often find in the present day. So, and they brought it in Ireland. Um, they sent over they set up a commission to examine in Ireland, and this commission said, "No way, it won't work here." So they abolished the commission and sent over someone else, and they brought it in, and it was basically finished in the early 1840s, just in time for the famine. In the meantime, so O'Connell, he wants to have a big monster meeting in Clontarf. The location is significant because of the Battle of Clontarf. The government bans it. O'Connell backs down, says okay. He's criticized from his own side for giving in, but he's also arrested and spends some months in jail. And then there's a split with Young Ireland. All of this halts the momentum for repeal, and then the famine comes. The potato crop fails, and then fails again, and fails again. So around 40% of the population, their basic diet is potatoes and possibly a small bit of milk. The potato crop fails and they've nothing. They've no food. At first, the government provides some aid, but then there's an election and a much more ideological government is elected. So it basically says, the workhouse system or let the poor law system sort it out. And the poor law system, another horrific aspect, meant that each area, each region would look after itself, had to pay for the workhouse. So poor areas had less money. Ireland collapsed. There were food exports, but and I know there's loads of controversy over that, but what people don't realize is that 40% of people are depending on the potato. This goes. It's going to, and throw that in with the workhouse system. The result is an apocalypse. It's horrific. O'Connell is worn out by this. He's on his way to Rome. He dies there in 1847, and is buried in Dublin. Part of becoming a Dublin in a way. And now just to kind of finish, just to conclude, so the 1590s and the first decades of the 19th century marked two very important phases in the emergence of modern Ireland. The 1590s was a long fight against Elizabeth. However, when victory was in sight, the war was lost, and Gaelic Ireland brutally destroyed. A possible historical path was aborted and a much more horrendous one established. Hugh O'Neill and others, they used the fate and fatherland ideology, as mentioned by here Morgan, trying to tie together identity and religion. In a way, it failed for them, but this ideology became very strong at the end of the 17th century. In a way, defeat ensured the success of this ideology. And then, so you go through a long period, the 18th century, a state constructed by the defeats of the 16th and 17th century. And then O'Connell, in the 1820s, he achieved the first victories, or he helped achieve the first victories for the Catholic Irish majority. These pointed to the power of the mass of the people, of people acting together. And they helped break the regime established by the so-called Glorious Revolution. Repeal movement failed. Emancipation won. Repeal movement failed. You could fault both O'Connell and the Young Irelanders. However, the horror of the famine just overwhelmed everything. A complex and multifaceted disaster caused by the failure of the potato crop, aggravated by the number of years it failed for, and even more by the poor law system based on an ideological belief in a deserving and undeserving poor. It just resulted in something that I think was just impossible for most individuals to deal with. How can you do politics when people are starving all around you? Nonetheless, O'Connell did help establish a mass democratic base of Irish politics. a question I have to ask, I think everyone should ask themselves, did this enable us to survive the horror of the famine, the land war, the failure to achieve home rule, the fall of Parnell, and worst of all, the Civil War? So, thank you. I think I've spoken for too long, almost an hour 15. I hope you enjoyed it. I see there's one point. I'm not sure what point you're making, Pete. The MacCarthys are here much before the 9 Years' War. They don't have any heritage anymore. Like, there's no such thing as a clan's heritage. There is the Irish people who, the land. Like, one thing about the land in Ireland. So with MacCarthy Moore, lordship was all of South Kerry, and then that was granted to a small number of people, such as Trinity College, Lord Kenmare, a few others. However, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a land war, various land acts. The result of that, unlike in England, was that the mass of land ended up in the hands of the people. So most Irish farmers own their farms thanks to these land acts, thanks to political campaigns. Unlike in England, say for example, the Duchy of Cornwall owns so much, or a few people own all of England, own the farms, which are then sublet. Ireland, the people own it. So, in a way, that's the heritage. There's nothing to preserve in that sort of way. The Gaelic Ireland is destroyed in the 17th century. Then O'Connell comes along, and his campaign, and then the campaigns of others such as Parnell, especially David and Land, changed the position completely. So most Irish farmers, the huge majority of them, ended up with their own land. And then there was help in the 20th century. The Land Commission, etc., broke up some other big estates. There's very few big estates in Ireland anymore because of that. Okay. Unless anyone has any other questions, I'm going to say good night because I need a drink of water. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was very long. I hope I didn't mumble or ramble too much. So thank you. I will probably do another live in a couple of weeks. So I'll see you soon. Slán.